Good evening. Welcome to another Zion's Banner broadcast. We've been doing a series related to the Incarnation. As always, I remind you that this material is available to you. If you like our Facebook page, Zion's Banner, please, I shouldn't say if you like our Facebook page. Please like our Facebook page, Zion's Banner. Also, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We continue to try and move materials from one to our website to the YouTube channel in good order, and if you're paying attention, we'll hopefully get better at the flow of things as we do this longer. I know that some people are in a different time zone. Things will be up on Facebook for a little while, so if you miss it tonight, it will be up tomorrow, and then it will end up on our website eventually. But again, we're looking forward to having you with us. This is a Bible study that's really carried on in the living room of dear friends of ours. So we're broadcasting from a home. It's kind of a fireside chat. We have some exegesis, we have apologetics, and then we have application. It's looking at things from God's big story. I do want to do some promotion. Arab Evangelism Conference I'm involved with, helping to set up and will be speaking at, occurs the 23rd and 24th. The first part of it, the Friday, will be at Hillside Baptist Church, 1344 West Thunderbird. It'll run from 6:30 to 9 because it is indeed a Friday evening. Saturday is the day I'll be speaking. That'll be at the First Arabic Church on 7732 West Campbell. We're going to have workshops. We're going to have speakers, including me and other than me. And we're also going to go ahead and do some mosque evangelism in there. So I'm really excited. We have apologists coming together to go ahead and share the gospel and equip the saints as far as Islam. So let's talk about tonight. We've been doing a three-part series on the Incarnation. Tonight we're going to look at an argument from the theophanies of God. Now I need to go ahead and define terms. Some of you know those terms because you're just plain smart and brilliant and you've heard this stuff before. Some people may be tuning in who don't. A theophany is a manifestation or appearance of God. And what we're going to see is that all those theophanies earlier lead up to the Incarnation. The Incarnation is sort of the accumulation of those theophanies. So let's start looking at those. What we're arguing from is the big picture, the big story of God, that there's a progression going on, and if there is indeed theophanies and God is appearing and this progression exists, that the Incarnation is a logical culmination of the theophanies. So we're going to look at the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord. Next week we're going to look at the issue of objections to the Incarnation. I'll talk more about that. And then Philippians chapter 2 and the difference between essential and accidental properties and how that works. Let's talk a little bit about the Shekinah. That's a Jewish term. But I need to define it. Now, you can define it through various Bible encyclopedias. The Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible is a definition that we're starting with first. Now, the PowerPoints are always posted, so if you want the PowerPoint to this, if you go to www.zionsbanner.org, you can have the PowerPoint sitting there. You can keep the PowerPoint. My gift to you, because we exist to make much of Messiah through God's big story. Baker's Encyclopedia of the Bible defines the Shekinah, or the glory of the Lord, as the visible manifestation of the majesty of God, apparently in the form of radiant light, is often referred to as the Shekinah glory. That is the glory of God which dwells. And so that's where we're at there. Now, I used a non-Jewish source. Let me use a Jewish source. Maybe I'm showing my bias a little bit, but the Shekinah is a Hebrew, or is a Jewish term that comes out of the Second Temple, around the Second Temple period. And so it's only fitting that we use a Jewish source. So if you want to go to a Jewish source, Michael Brown quotes a scholar, Ephraim Urbach, who wrote a book called The Scholars, He's an Israeli scholar, and he calls the Shekinah the presence of God in the world. The Shekinah was one of the important rabbinical ways to explain, now pay attention to this, how an infinite and transcendent God could really be with his people. And that was one of the main topics during the Second Temple period, is how does transcendent God remain outside of his creation, other than his creation, transcendent, and still enter into his creation. And one of the ways the rabbis dealt with this was the Shekinah. The Shekinah was a way that God could be in his creation and still remain transcendent. That was theological table talk in the days when Jesus or Yeshua walked the earth. You can use the Hebrew term, you can use the English term. I'm not going to be offended. God's multilingual, and so I'm not going to tell him that he can't hear it in English tonight. But you need to be aware of both terms. Now let me lay out the argument for you, because one of our purposes here at Zion's Banner is to make much out of Messiah, but it's to get us to think. Christians need to be the best thinkers. We are told to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that means that we have to use the thing occasionally. So I want to lay the argument out for you. If God, premise one, can take the form and appearances such as the Shekinah, i.e. the form of a glorious light in a cloud, then he can take the form of an image bearer. That's what human beings are. They're image bearers. He can take the form of an image bearer. This type of argument is called kol v'chomer. Means light to heavy, but it can be stated as chomer v'kol. It can go from light to heavy, or from heavy to light. Now what I'm saying is, if the lesser is true, then the greater is true also. So if God can do the smaller thing, such as the Shekinah, he can do the greater thing. And by the way, if you want to regard the Shekinah as the greater thing, then he can do the lesser thing. Okay? Now, premise two, if he took the form of the Shekinah, then it follows that he could very well decide to take the form of an image bearer. So he's capable. Premise two deals with whether he's willing. If he's willing to come and be among his people as a glorious light, as a cloud, why would he be unwilling to be among his people in the form of an image bearer? Okay, if he's willing to show up as a burning bush, he'd be willing to show up as a person. Okay, and again, this is this light to heavy, heavy to light type of argument. Now, premise three, God can and did take the form of the Shekinah. Logical conclusion, he could and might very well take the form of a man. Now, what we're arguing for here is verification. But we're arguing that that verification comes from the fact that because he did, could, and was willing to do the lesser, that it follows logically as a culmination or as a fullness of that he would go ahead and take the greater. Now I consider being the human being the greater. Again, you could do this as a greater to lesser or a lesser to greater, but image bearers, human beings, can display the moral attributes of God in a way that a glorious light would not. So I consider the image bearer, man, human being, to be the greater. Even if you take it the other way, the argument still works. So we've laid out a plausibility, logical culmination argument that shows that if it were true that God could and was willing to appear as the Shekinah glory, then culminatively it would make perfect sense for him to be willing and able to appear as a man. I'll include how I use this in a story at some point here, but I want to move to the next slide. Now we're going to do some exegesis. Now exegesis means we look at the text and we go ahead and we talk about the text, because we don't want to pull points out of context. We want to look at the big picture. We want to look at the scriptures, but we want to use reasoning too, and we want to develop this argument. So if you have your electronic Bible on your phone, you're going to turn to Exodus 16. I'm being a little funny here because you don't turn to Exodus 16 on a digital phone. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the beginning of Exodus 16. I have not yet learned to do screen share. My friend Vocab is a lot better with this. And his software is probably a little better than my computer is because it's spinning out a little bit here. And it doesn't like Exodus tonight. But that's okay. We will teach it a lesson because it needs to love the whole Word of God. So we're going to go to Exodus 16 here. My Bible will pull it up in the Hebrew and the English. I like to do my devotions in both, actually. Whenever I can. It helps to keep my Hebrew vocabulary alive. That means that sometimes I have to download. So you probably have it up before I do. Let's talk about the background of Exodus 16, though, and we can do that. Exodus covers the historical development of the history of God's people Israel from slavery to theocracy. So when you start Exodus, you're starting with slavery at the beginning of Exodus. You move to the end of Exodus, and Israel is a worshiping community with God present. They are what's called a theocracy. That means that God directly rules them. Some of the key points of Exodus, we call these themes. These are reoccurring pictures or reoccurring points that occur over and over and over again. And it's good to know the themes in a given book of the Bible. But the themes include knowing God through His revealing of Himself. The book of Exodus is a book of revelation in the sense that it is about God revealing Himself to His people. We also see in Exodus God's justice and His compassion. And then there's a call to obedience that runs throughout Exodus. The key theme or concept in Exodus is that of covenant. And I would say that's true for the Pentateuch. But Exodus is gonna really kind of focus in on that covenant. Sinai is a marriage and a covenant sort of thing. So we're going to look at the beginning of this. Exodus is about the manna. Yeah, I know, it's manna. But the Hebrew word manna really comes from manna. It means, what is it? Because really when they saw this stuff, they said, what is it? And so you have the beginning of the first couple verses, and what you see is the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And in verse 1 through verse 3, they basically give the lament that, the dining was so much better in Egypt. We had food to eat, we had water. Never mind we were under cruel slavery. Never mind we were abused and beaten. It was so much nicer there. And they go through a period of whining and nostalgia. I don't know which you'd call which when, but that's essentially what they do. They go into whining and nostalgia. 1 through 3 is the complaint. Verses 4 and 5, they're given instructions for collecting the manna, God's answer to their complaint. And verse 6 says that God is going to make a personal appearance in the person of the Shekinah. And I said person of the Shekinah. When I do this in terms of the DNA of the Trinity, which I'll actually be doing at this Arab conference, we demonstrate that the Shekinah is more than just deity, it's also distinct. In other words, God is God, the Shekinah is God at the same time, and if God is God and the Shekinah is God, then there's room for plurality. We're not going to spend time there. We're spending time on the Incarnation. As we start to look at this, let me tell you a story about being out at a mosque evangelizing, because this issue of the Incarnation and the Trinity is really important for several different areas of apologetics. As it was pointed out when I was on a radio apologetics talk show for a couple minutes this afternoon with my good friend Vocab. Shout out to Vocab. He's probably busy doing a whole host of things. But he pointed it out. This is really important doctrine. And so a Arab gentleman said, exalted God cannot become a man. By the way, you hear this from Jewish objections too. And I asked him which was harder, to become a burning bush or to become a man. And if God could become a burning bush, why can't He become a man? And that's essentially the type of argument we're using here. That the Incarnation is really the culmination, it's a logical culmination of theophany, or God appearing. So, as we're looking at this, we're going to move through this. They journeyed from Elam in verse 1, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of, it says Sin in the English, but it doesn't have the same meaning, lest you think that there's some sort of clever thing going on here. There are plenty of Hebrew words for transgression, and that is not the word being used there. They came to the wilderness of Sin, and they complained to Moses and Aaron. And the children of Israel in verse 3 say, "Oh, that we would have died in the land, by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sought by pots of meat, and where we ate bread to the full." I don't know that they ate all that much bread, and the menu was so great in slavery. "For you have brought us out to this wilderness to kill us, surely the assembly with hunger." That's ridiculous. Okay? Now remember, these people are used to being enslaved. So let's be fair about this. A little bit of human nature goes a long way. And I'm not going to make like the rabbis, like the children of Israel were totally excellent in their behavior in this complaint. No, the scriptures don't indicate that. But we do need to realize that, hey, they didn't get it yet. They didn't get it later on. How many times don't we get it? Now I'm moving this up, and the Lord gives instructions because He's going to meet their need. By the way, while they're kvetching, that's a nice Yiddish word for complaining, the Lord takes steps to meet their need. And He says He's going to rain bread from heaven. When has this ever happened before? And they're to gather it, but He's going to test them. He's not going to test them because He doesn't know what's in their hearts. He's going to test them to make what's in their hearts come out of their hearts. That's the purpose of a test, to make manifest what is there. God doesn't need any help knowing what's in our hearts, but God occasionally wants to make what's in our hearts come out of our hearts. And so He goes ahead and He says He's going to test them, and they're not to collect on the Sabbath, they're to collect a double portion. That's why there are 2 challahs on a Sabbath table. Double portion is given. Now let's get to the Shekinah here, because that's why we're here, but I wanted to give you the exegetical background. Moses said to the children of Israel, "At evening you shall know that the Lord brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for He," this is fascinating, He refers to the glory of the Lord. He has heard your complaints against the Lord. So the Shekinah has heard your complaints against the Lord. Now if you're following a little bit, you may find that your PDF switched a slide here and it took you to Leviticus 16. I wanted to give you a bit of a backdrop here, but Leviticus 16:2, God, this demonstrates the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord, is God. "And the Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron not to come in at just any time, not to come in just any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat, lest he die. For I will appear," this is God speaking. Remember, the Lord said to Moses, "I will appear in a cloud above the mercy seat." So God says that He will appear in a cloud above the mercy seat. But wait a minute, it's the glory of the Lord that's appearing between the cherubim, which means that the glory of the Lord is indeed God. The Shekinah is God. That means that God chose to appear or manifest Himself in the form of the Shekinah glory. We're not going to go into the Shekinah being a person and distinct, but you could prove it from this verse pretty quickly. Exodus 10 and 11. Now it's interesting. Later on in the same chapter, it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and they looked towards the wilderness, behold, remember, God said He was going to visit them in the evening as the glory of the Lord. He looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud, and the Lord spoke to Moses. Wait a minute, who's speaking to Moses? God. Who's speaking to Moses? The glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord then is God. Okay, now we're talking about God being unable to manifest Himself as a man. but yet we have God manifesting himself as the Shekinah. He could manifest himself as the Shekinah, and he did manifest himself as the Shekinah. Therefore, it is logical that he could and would manifest himself as an image bearer. We have the same sorts of thing again. The Shekinah is in Exodus 25. Now, what's exciting about Exodus 25 is we're talking about the instructions for building the tabernacle where God will dwell with his people. So this whole section centers on the building all the way from 24 to 31, instructions for building the sanctuary. And God says, build me a sanctuary that I might dwell among my people. So God's desire is to dwell among them. How is he going to dwell among them? As the Shekinah glory of God. So the background of this becomes real important. 25:22, there I will meet with you. This is God talking. And I will speak to you. I, God, will speak to you from above the mercy seat between the cherubim. What's dwelling above the mercy seat with the cherubim? The Shekinah glory of God is dwelling there. The Shekinah glory of God is dwelling above the cherubim. But Exodus 25:22 tells us that God says, I will meet with you between the cherubim. Therefore, the Shekinah glory of God is indeed God. Now remember our argument here. The theophany are cumulatively, logically and cumulatively point to an incarnation. Remember that the Muslim guy said to me, God, exalted God would never become a man. My father would say to me, exalted God, the God of Sinai, would never deem to become a man. But yet, as I said to him, which is harder, to become a burning bush or to become a man? If God could and would become the Shekinah glory of God, the glory of God, God being present and manifest as a light in a cloud, then he certainly would do the greater thing of becoming an image bearer. Kol v'chomer is the type of argument. But if you really want to argue that the cloud is so much niftier than a human being is, then you can do it chomer v'kol, and the argument still works. Either way, we have an argument from the incarnation by virtue of the theophany. So we're building this. This piece alone is not a slam dunk. But remember that you take the language from last week that points to an incarnation. You take this, the theophanies. You take God walking with Adam in the garden and how that Genesis is understood in terms of Malachi 3. The Lord you seek will come to his temple. And then you take direct prophecies and you put them together and you have an overwhelming argument for the incarnation that can be used in so many different venues. What about the angel of the Lord? Now this gets really interesting because now God's not just coming as a light in the cloud. He's coming as a talking, sentient being. Sentient. Mind, will, and emotions. Okay? For those non-Star Trek fans out there, we use the term sentient. Would God visit as an angelic being? Now let's set up the argument again here because we want to think biblically. We don't want to be biblical and not think, and we don't want to think and be unbiblical. We want to use our brains and we want to apply logic and the scriptures to come up with a way to winsomely defend and demonstrate the beauty of the Christian or Messianic worldview. So let's lay out the argument. The first premise, if God can take the form of an angel, that he can take the form of an image bearer. It's all I'm using our simple kol v'chomer type arguments. Rabbinical arguing uses all the time. If he would take the form of an angel, then he would be willing to take the form of an image bearer. Why would this be so hard to buy? God can and did take the form of an angel, therefore he could and might very well take the form of a man. Now remember, the incarnation hasn't happened yet, but we're showing a cumulative case here, and we're saying the theophany all point to something greater. Greater to lesser. Kol v'chomer type argument. So if he did the lesser, he would do the greater by becoming an image bearer. So we've laid out our argument here. So let's talk about the binding of Isaac. This is probably one of the most important sections in Scripture for Jewish people. By the way, you can point to this with Muslims, but you have to be careful. They will argue about which son of Abraham it is. The Quran doesn't state which son of Abraham it is, but the Hadith does state that it's Ishmael. That's a little difference between the Quran and actually the Hadith, which are the traditions. That's for another day. Okay? But remember, I'm applying this both to Judaism, and I'm also being involved with an evangelism to Muslim conference. I deal with the crossover. And more I'm seeing the crossover and the exchange of thought between Judaism and Islam. Judaism being the Judaism of the rabbis. So if your electronic phone is better than my computer, you can go to Genesis 22. Now I actually do a message on this, which much the same title as this, The God Who Visits. So we're going to go ahead and look at this. It's called the Akedah in Hebrew. Folks who are familiar know about the Parsha system. This actually appears in the Jewish prayer book. Now, Jewish prayer book's 80% scripture, but let's just say every Orthodox Jew prays a good part of this exact account every morning. So, we know how this goes. God decides to test Abraham. Remember what I said, testing is not so God, who's omniscient, can figure out what's in our hearts. He doesn't have that problem. It's so that what's inside spills outside. It's to manifest to us, and even sometimes to other people, what's in our hearts. We learn something, other people learn something. God doesn't need to learn anything. And God tells him to take his son, his only son. That's really kind of interesting. The one whom you love. I'm not going to get into arguing, and I don't start an argument with Muslims here. Okay? Because what I'm interested is, look, if Jesus gets a hold of them, we can teach them the other stuff. But if they don't understand atonement and the big story of God, the story of redemption, then what they get from the other stuff is not gonna end up amounting to anything. So we move through this, and Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac. God has a plan. Dershowitz doesn't like this story, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time as to why. This is not unethical, because people ask about the ethicalness of this story. There's nothing unethical here. First of all, Isaac doesn't die. So, second of all, God isn't doing this to be cruel. God is doing this to sanctify. And third of all, he is also demonstrating atonement. What you need to remember from the beginning of this is who decided to test Abraham. Okay? God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, I'm here. Now we've got to establish the subject. Okay? God is speaking to Abraham. Okay? That becomes important because God is speaking to Abraham, right? And Abraham goes to slay his son in verse 10. Abraham stretched out his hand, took the knife to slay his son, and the angel of the Lord called to him. Oh, wait a minute now. God was the one who talked to Abraham. The angel of the Lord calls to him, and Abraham answers. And he says, do not lay your hand on the boys, for now I know you fear God, since you've not withheld your only begotten son from who? From me. The angel of the Lord is God. He's deity. And so that's terribly important for us to know. Now remember, we're talking about theophanies here. The other place that's really good to go is Exodus chapter 3, which is the burning bush. Now the reason I like this is this Bible story appears in the Quran. So it's one of those Bible studies that's not altered in the Quran. So it's a beautiful crossover. And that's why I used it with this Arab gentleman actually in front of the mosque. Is one, it's absolutely great with a Jewish audience, but it's wonderful at handling an Islamic objection, because you can always say, does your Quran record the story that God spoke to Moses from a burning bush? Or God spoke as a burning bush to Moses? And so you see the beauty of this. Okay? And so we're moving here, and what's important to see is that Moses is doing his thing. We're in Exodus chapter 3, 1 through 4. We don't have to go very far for this at all. He's doing his thing in chapter 1. There's so much excellent sermon material here. And I love doing that message. Moses decides to turn aside and see this sight. This is a bush that's burning and is not consumed. It's not something you see every day. And of course, when he does, it says the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside, and God called to him. Now, this is this thing right here, and you find out that the angel of the Lord in the same passage appeared to him in the flame of fire. So you have the flame of fire being the angel of the Lord appearing in it, being God and speaking to him, and then Moses says, "Here am I." Okay, we're running out of time because we try to keep it within a certain time zone. Here's the take-home truth. God's theophanies demonstrate his desire to be with us, which is realized in the incarnation. God did and was willing to appear as an angel, therefore light to heavy, or heavy to light, whichever way you want to slice it. He could and would logically be willing to appear as a man. And so we see that the incarnation is not only plausible, but it is logical in light of the theophanies that occur before it. So we have language of God actually appearing and coming to his temple and walking with man. We have the theophanies that point to an eventual incarnation. We haven't even touched prophecy that indicates that Messiah will be God. Well, we briefly did with Malachi 3, actually. Next week, what we'll deal with is objections and how do we reconcile God's divine properties with him taking on human form. We're not going to totally answer this mystery because it's a great mystery. We're going to understand, we are going to go ahead and look at Philippians 2. What do we mean by the incarnation and what don't we mean? And how does that play out with what we understand philosophically about properties so that God's divine properties are not threatened by his taking on the form of a man. Let's make some final application, because we always do. God longs for fellowship with us that we might reflect him. Are you pleasing him by reflecting him in your daily life this week? As always, I'm thrilled for everyone who came in. I love seeing the little green things up. I hope you stuck with me, but it'll stay on Facebook for a while, and then it'll be posted on our website. So for tonight, shalom, shalom. It was good having you with us.